It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few days in my late grandmother's old cabin. The place sat deep in the woods outside a small town in northern Montana, about an hour from the nearest gas station and another 30 minutes from a paved road. I hadn't been there in almost 15 years, not since I was a kid, but I remembered the place clearly. The narrow dirt trail leading to the porch, the faded red paint peeling off the walls, and the thick smell of pine that filled the air around it. My grandmother, Evelyn, had passed away 5 years ago, and the cabin had just been sitting there, empty and untouched since. No one in the family wanted to deal with it. I had just turned 30 and was going through one of those stretches of life where nothing felt right. My job was dull, my apartment was noisy, and I barely slept. I thought maybe a few quiet nights in the cabin would clear my head. I packed my old pickup with supplies, some canned food, a lantern, a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, and brought my dog, Milo, a big black Labrador who didn't leave my side for anything. We left early one morning, and by the time we got near the property, the sky had turned gray, and a light drizzle had started falling. The closer we got, the more the trees thickened, branches reaching over the dirt road like arms closing in. When I finally parked, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little, the wooden steps leading to the porch were warped, and tall weeds grew up around the base. The air smelled damp and heavy, like old soil. The place gave off a strange quiet, not peaceful but heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Inside, it was darker than I expected. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling corners. The air smelled like old wood and something else, something faintly sour like mold or spoiled fruit. I opened a few windows, but they barely moved, the hinges stiff with rust. Milo sniffed around, his tail wagging slowly as he explored each corner. I found the old kerosene lamp on the table and lit it, the flame flickering weakly and casting an orange glow on the walls. The first night was calm but uneasy. The cabin creaked and popped as the temperature dropped. I could hear faint scratching from under the floorboards, probably mice or squirrels. Milo lay beside me on the old couch, sometimes lifting his head and staring toward the back hallway, ears perked. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the sounds of an old house settling, but there was something about the way he stared, like he was trying to make sense of a smell I couldn't detect. The next morning, I started cleaning. The kitchen had jars of preserves lined on the shelves, their contents turned dark and cloudy. The fridge, surprisingly, still stood where it always had, though unplugged and empty except for a few rusted metal trays. I found some old photo frames lying on the counter, covered in dust. Pictures of my grandmother standing by the lake, smiling with her gardening hat, her hands always stained with dirt. Around noon, I decided to check the back rooms. There were 2 small bedrooms and 1 storage room. The first bedroom was empty except for a broken bed frame and a dresser missing its drawers. The second bedroom was my grandmother's old room. Her bed was still made, though the sheets had turned yellow and stiff. The air in there felt colder than the rest of the cabin. I noticed that the wooden floor near the bed had a section that looked slightly raised, like a loose board. I didn't think much of it then and just moved on. That night, the scratching grew louder. It came from somewhere behind the walls and underneath the floor. Milo growled softly, standing up and pacing near the door. Around midnight, I heard something heavier than a mouse, something that made the floor creak faintly. My skin prickled, but I told myself it was probably a raccoon or stray animal sheltering from the rain. Still, I barely slept. The third day, I went out back to clear some of the overgrown weeds and debris. The backyard sloped down toward a small clearing with a rusted water pump and an old shed that leaned to one side. The shed door was slightly open. Inside, there were broken tools, a rusted saw, and a few wooden crates stacked in a corner. The smell hit me first, thick and foul like rotting meat, I thought maybe an animal had crawled in and died. I tried to check, but the crates were too heavy to move, and the stench made my stomach twist. I shut the door and decided to deal with it later. That evening, I found something odd while walking back to the cabin. Near the edge of the property, the ground looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had dug there recently. The soil was darker, softer than the rest, and had no weeds growing on it. I figured maybe an animal had dug something up, but the hole was too neat, too rectangular. It was about 3 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide. I stood there for a while, staring at it, feeling a strange unease crawl up my neck. I ended up covering it with fallen branches and leaves, trying to shake it from my mind. Later that night, it started raining hard. Wind rattled the windows, and the cabin groaned like something alive. Milo wouldn't settle down. He paced in front of the hallway again, growling softly, staring toward my grandmother's bedroom. The scratching had stopped now, replaced by occasional dull thumps that seemed to come from under the floorboards. I could feel the faint vibration through the soles of my boots when I walked. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check the room. The air in there was freezing, and the smell of decay was stronger. My light flicked across the floor and stopped at that raised board I had noticed before. It looked more uneven now, like it had shifted slightly upward. I crouched and ran my hand over it. The wood felt soft and damp. I wedged the flat end of a hammer underneath and pried it up. Came loose with a crack. Underneath was a shallow cavity, lined with dirt. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There was fabric, maybe an old blanket, but as I pulled the board aside completely, the light caught something pale: skin. Human skin. I froze. The shape beneath the blanket was unmistakable. A body. The air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. Milo whimpered beside me, his nose pressed to the floor, tail low and stiff. I wanted to believe it was a trick, that maybe it was a mannequin or something else, but the faint smell that came up from the cavity told me otherwise. It was the same smell from the shed, the same one that had been haunting the cabin since I got there. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The face was unrecognizable, mostly bones now, but there was still some hair clinging to the skull, thin, gray strands. My stomach turned. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Drive out right then? I could barely move. The next morning, after the sun rose, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat. I grabbed Milo, locked the cabin door, and drove until I hit the main road. At the gas station, I called the sheriff's office and told them what I found. They sent people out there that afternoon. A few days later, one of the deputies contacted me. They said the remains were indeed human. Based on the clothes and what little evidence was left, it was most likely my grandmother's neighbor, a man named Henry Barker, who'd gone missing nearly 20 years ago. He'd been last seen near her property, helping her fix the fence before he disappeared. There were signs of blunt trauma on the skull. The police didn't say much else, only that the case would be reopened. But as the days went on, I started remembering small things. How my grandmother had suddenly stopped talking about Henry after that year. How she told everyone she didn't need help around the cabin anymore. How she always kept that one room locked when I was a kid. It took me weeks to stop thinking about it. But even now, when I picture her face in those old photos, smiling by the lake, I can't help but wonder what really happened that day, and how long that body had been lying there beneath her floor, while the rest of us went on believing she was just a sweet old woman living alone in the woods. I never went back to that cabin again. The county took it over, boarded it up, and eventually they said they'd demolish it. But sometimes, when I drive through the northern roads of Montana and see a line of old trees along a forgotten dirt path, I can still picture it standing there, quiet, rotting, keeping its secrets buried just a few feet below the floorboards. It was October of 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin tucked away in the Lake District of Northern England. I was 31 at the time, working a dull office job in Manchester, and my mind felt completely burned out. The idea of isolating myself somewhere quiet sounded perfect. I had rented the cabin through a small local agency, one of those listings with low-quality photos and a vague description. Asterisk secluded cabin near Ullswater. No neighbors, no internet, perfect for peace and quiet. Asterisk it sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive took about 4 hours. The farther I got from the main roads, the narrower the lanes became. Eventually, I was following a muddy trail that twisted through tall trees and scattered patches of mist. The GPS lost signal somewhere around Penrith, and after that, I had to rely on printed directions the agency had emailed me earlier. The air outside looked heavy and damp, the kind that clings to your jacket. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. An old wooden structure with a rusted tin roof, surrounded by tall grass and moss-covered stones. There was a small shed about 20 feet behind it, half collapsed, with its door hanging open. I parked the car in front and stepped out. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Everything was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a small kitchen, a single bed pushed against the far wall, and an old iron stove in the corner. There was a small table with 2 chairs and a narrow window that looked out toward the woods. It was simple but clean. I unpacked my bags, made some tea, and sat by the window for a while, just listening to the silence. By the time evening came, the fog had rolled in thicker, covering the trees like a gray blanket. The only sound was the occasional dripping of water from the roof. I lit the stove and opened a can of soup. Everything felt fine, peaceful even. But around midnight, while I was reading, I heard something faint outside. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was rhythmic, like the slow crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe someone hiking through, but the steps sounded too deliberate, too slow. They stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I stood up and went to the window. The fog made it impossible to see far, but I could make out the vague outline of the shed in the distance. I waited, staring, my heart beating harder with every second. Nothing moved. The sound had stopped completely. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably just an animal. I went back to bed, though I barely slept. I woke up early the next morning, and when I stepped outside, I noticed something odd near the shed. The grass in front of it was flattened in a small, uneven patch, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I didn't think much of it at first. I made breakfast, took a short walk down the trail, and tried to relax. By afternoon, the fog had cleared, revealing the hills beyond the trees. The area was empty, no other houses, no people. I started to feel better again. But when night fell, that uneasy feeling crept back. Around 10 p.m., I was sitting by the stove when I heard the same slow steps again. Only this time, they came from behind the cabin, near the shed. I froze. The sound came closer, crunching through the leaves until it stopped just outside the back wall. The silence that followed was the longest, heaviest silence I've ever felt. I didn't move. My breathing felt too loud. Then, through the narrow side window, I saw something. A shape, person. It was a woman, thin, tall, wearing what looked like a long coat or dress that reached her ankles. Her hair was dark and messy, hanging forward so I couldn't see her face clearly. She was standing beside the shed, just barely visible in the dim light leaking from the window. She wasn't moving, just standing there, slightly tilted to one side. I stayed still for what felt like minutes, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to make a sound. My mind tried to reason it could be a lost hiker or maybe someone from a nearby farm. But she wasn't carrying a light, and there were no nearby farms. After a long while, She turned her head slowly toward the cabin. I couldn't see her eyes through the glass, but I felt her looking right at me. That was enough. I backed away from the window, grabbed the small kitchen knife I had used earlier, and stood in the center of the room, waiting. The sound of the wind picked up again, and I kept listening for any sign of movement. After maybe 10 minutes, I peeked out again. She was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights off and sat near the stove until morning. When daylight finally came, I went outside to check. There were faint footprints in the mud, bare feet, not shoes. They led from the back of the cabin to the shed and then disappeared into the woods. I thought about leaving that morning, but I convinced myself that maybe she was just passing through. Maybe she was camping or homeless. Still, the thought of those bare footprints in the cold mud didn't sit right with me. I spent the day packing some things in case I decided to leave early. That evening, the fog returned thicker than before. I stayed inside, keeping the lights low. Around 9 p.m., I heard something scrape against the front door, soft, dragging, like nails against wood. Then it stopped. I sat on the bed, gripping the knife again, trying to keep calm. The sound came again, this time from the side of the cabin, then the back. It was like she was circling it slowly. I moved quietly to the window and looked out toward the shed. The fog was dense, but I could make out a figure again, standing near the edge of the trees. It was her. Same long coat, same posture. She was standing completely still, facing the cabin. I wanted to shout, to tell her to go away, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth felt dry, my chest tight. I backed away from the window again, and after what felt like forever, I heard the faint sound of steps retreating into the woods. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed everything into the car as quickly as I could. Before leaving, I took one last look toward the shed. That's when I noticed the door wasn't hanging open anymore. It was shut tight. I knew for certain it had been open when I arrived. Something about that made my stomach turn. Still, I forced myself to check. I walked toward it slowly, the ground still damp from the night before. My boots sank slightly with every step. When I reached the door, I hesitated before pulling it open. Inside, the shed smelled of rot and damp wood. There were old tools scattered around, a rusted shovel, some empty cans, and a few wooden crates stacked in the corner. Then, I noticed something small on the dirt floor, a piece of fabric. It looked torn from clothing, faded red, and damp with mud. Nearby were two small footprints, side by side, pressed into the dirt. Bare feet again. That was all I needed to see. I got in the car and left, driving faster than I should have on that narrow road. The fog thinned as I reached the main road, and by the time I hit the motorway, it was gone completely. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about missing people or strange sightings near Ullswater. I found an article from 2011, 5 years earlier, about a woman who had gone missing while hiking in that same area. The photo showed a woman with long dark hair, wearing a long coat. She'd never been found. Even now, when I think about that week, it feels unreal, but I know what I saw. The way she moved, the way she stood, the sound of her bare feet in the mud. It wasn't a ghost or a dream. She was real. Someone who had once been alive and lost, now wandering that same patch of woods, maybe living out there somewhere. I haven't gone back to the Lake District since. I can still picture her shape through the fog, standing there silent, watching. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night through quiet roads, that same image flashes in my mind. I always glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there, standing barefoot in the dark, waiting for me to stop. It was the autumn of 2012 when I decided to spend a few days alone at my uncle's old cabin that sat right next to an abandoned graveyard outside a small town in northern Maine. The place had been empty for years, and I'd always been a little curious about it. My uncle had passed away the year before, and the cabin was now in my name. I figured I'd drive up, clean it out, maybe stay the weekend, and decide whether to sell it or keep it as a getaway spot. I didn't think much about the graveyard when I made the plan. It was just a piece of land with old stones, probably forgotten by everyone else. The drive there took about 5 hours. The air grew colder and heavier the deeper I went into the woods. By the time I reached the narrow dirt road leading to the property, the trees looked older, thicker, almost like they hadn't been touched in decades. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and my headlights flickered across leaning tombstones on the right side of the road. The graveyard stretched for what felt like a few hundred yards. Rows of crooked stones, most of them covered in moss or fallen leaves. I could barely make out names. Some had no names left at all, just eroded rock. The cabin stood at the end of the road, sitting about 50 feet from the edge of the graveyard, with a small clearing between them. The cabin itself looked tired. Faded wood, rusted nails, and a roof that sagged near the back. When I stepped inside, the smell hit first. It was a mix of damp wood, old dust, and faint mildew. I left the door open to air it out while I unpacked. The main room had a stone fireplace, 2 chairs, a small table, and a single cot against the wall. I found an old kerosene lantern on a shelf, a few canned goods that looked ancient, and some tools in a crate near the door. My uncle hadn't lived there full time, so most of it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. By evening, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a small fire in the fireplace using old wood from behind the cabin. The crackling sound filled the room, and I sat there watching the flames move in the reflection of the lantern light. Outside, the woods were quiet except for the wind sliding through the branches. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant call of a crow or the faint creak of old wood somewhere outside. It was peaceful in a lonely kind of way. That first night, I couldn't sleep much. The cot was uncomfortable, and every little sound made me tense. I kept hearing what sounded like light tapping, sometimes on the wall, sometimes near the window. I told myself it was probably acorns falling or tree branches moving in the wind. Around midnight, I got up and looked outside. The moonlight was bright enough to light up the clearing and part of the graveyard. The tombstones stood like shadows in rows, and the grass looked silver under the moon. I remember staring at it for a while, not because I saw anything unusual, but because it looked strange, still and empty, like time didn't touch it anymore. I eventually fell asleep near dawn. The next morning, I went outside with a cup of coffee and walked toward the edge of the graveyard. The air was cold, and the ground was soft under my boots. I brushed leaves off a few headstones, reading what names were still visible. Most were from the late 1800s, a few early 1900s. There was one large stone in the center that had cracked right down the middle. It didn't have a name anymore, just a faint carving of the year 1873. I walked around it, noticing how the soil there seemed more sunken than the rest, like it had settled deeper over time. There were no flowers, no signs that anyone had visited this place in years. Later that afternoon, clouds rolled in, and it started to rain. The roof leaked in 2 places, so I put a couple of pots under the drips. The sound of rain against the tin roof filled the cabin, steady and slow. I spent most of that day cleaning, sweeping dust off the floor, and clearing cobwebs. Around dusk, I noticed something strange near the graveyard. There were fresh footprints in the mud, leading from the edge of the clearing toward the graves. They looked too clean to be old. The shape was human, a man's boot, maybe size 10 or 11, judging by the depth and size. The problem was, I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. My truck was the only vehicle on that road, and I hadn't noticed anyone walking nearby. I followed the prints for a few yards until they disappeared between two rows of stones. There were no more after that. No return tracks, nothing leading deeper or back toward the woods. Just gone. The ground was too wet for the prints to vanish that quickly unless the person stepped carefully on dry patches. But I saw none. I stood there for a few minutes, looking around, feeling that tight unease you get when you realize something doesn't add up. The rain picked up, so I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake it off. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft, rhythmic sound. It was coming from outside, somewhere near the side of the cabin that faced the graveyard. It wasn't wind this time. It sounded like footsteps, slow, dragging ones. I sat there on the cot, listening. The sound would come, stop, then come again, each time a little closer. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a while. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. After a minute or two, the footsteps stopped completely. I waited another 15 minutes, then stood up quietly and went to the window. There was nothing out there. The clearing was empty. The rain had stopped, and a faint fog hung over the ground, drifting between the tombstones. I stood there staring for a long time, expecting to see someone moving, but nothing did. Just fog and silence. When I finally turned away, I realized my shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I went out again, even though part of me didn't want to. I found new footprints, the same kind, only this time they were much closer to the cabin. They circled halfway around it, then stopped near the back corner by the old woodpile. The ground there was wet enough that I could see the clear outline of each step. Whoever it was had been walking there sometime during the night. I checked the woods, walked all around the property, but saw no sign of anyone.
No tens, no vehicles, no broken branches.
It didn't make sense. By evening, I had made up my mind to leave in the morning. I packed up most of my stuff, leaving just my sleeping bag and a few things for the night. I kept the lantern lit and the fire going until late. Every sound outside made me flinch. The creak of the porch, the shifting of the trees, the popping of the firewood. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it came from the direction of the graveyard. A faint rustling, then what sounded like something being dragged across the wet ground. I didn't move. The dragging stopped after a minute, then nothing. I sat awake until sunrise. When daylight came, I went straight outside. My hands were shaking a little, but I needed to see. The ground between the cabin and the graveyard was disturbed. The grass flattened and the mud torn up in a narrow line, like something heavy had been pulled across it. The line led directly to that broken headstone in the center. The soil around it looked freshly moved, darker and softer than the rest. I crouched down, and the smell hit me. Damp earth mixed with something sour, metallic, like old rot. I didn't touch it. I just stared for a while, then backed away slowly. That was it for me. I packed the rest of my things, threw everything in the truck, and left without looking back. On the drive out, I noticed something I hadn't before. Along the fence that bordered the graveyard, there were several gaps, like someone had pushed through recently. The ground there was torn and muddy too, as if something had come out rather than gone in. I never went back to that cabin. I signed the paperwork to sell it a few months later without even visiting again. The new owner didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer any answers. Sometimes, though, when I can't sleep, I think about that broken headstone and the deep line in the ground leading right to it. Whatever it wasn't something I wanted to understand. The cabin's probably still there, leaning and rotting beside that graveyard, waiting for the next person curious enough to stay. And maybe they'll notice those footprints too. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin I had rented in northern Montana. I was 32 then, living a quiet life in Missoula, working remotely, and tired of the noise and constant movement of the city. I wanted silence. I wanted to sit somewhere still, far from people, with only my dog, Rex, and the sound of trees around me. I found this cabin through an old online listing. No pictures, just a short description and a low price. It was supposed to be a hunter's rest cabin, small but sturdy, near a frozen creek and surrounded by dense pine forest. The drive there took nearly 5 hours. By the time I reached the gravel path that led toward the cabin, the sun had already started to sink. The dirt road was rough and narrow, full of potholes and covered in dry leaves. My truck bounced and rattled the whole way. Rex, a brown German shepherd, sat in the passenger seat, quiet but alert, occasionally sniffing at the air like he knew something I didn't. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, it was smaller than I had imagined. Made of dark logs, one window on the front, a rusty metal chimney poking out from the top. There was an old wooden shed behind it, the kind that looked like it could collapse in one strong wind. The air was colder here, sharper, and the smell of pine mixed with the faint scent of wet soil. I parked the truck a few feet from the porch, stepped out, and stretched. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and a distant creek somewhere behind the cabin. No birds, no voices, nothing else. Inside, the cabin was as simple as it could get. A small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a bed with an old mattress that smelled faintly of dampness. The floorboards creaked when I walked, and dust hung in the air, catching the light from the window. There was a small cupboard with a few old canned goods, beans, peaches, and something unlabeled. It was clear no one had been here for months, maybe even years. That first evening, I built a fire in the stove and unpacked my things. Food, a flashlight, a knife, a sleeping bag, and a few tools. Rex lay near the fire, his head resting on his paws, eyes half open. It was peaceful for a while. I made myself some soup, ate quietly, and listened to the wind outside. When it got dark, I turned off the flashlight and let the firelight fill the cabin. The silence felt heavy, but I liked it. I went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. Rex was standing near the door, ears pointed, growling low. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was dimly lit by the orange glow. I sat up slowly, trying to listen. There was a faint sound outside, something moving. Not the wind, not branches. It was a steady, slow crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I waited, thinking maybe it was a deer or some other animal. Rex's growl grew deeper. Then it stopped. The footsteps faded away. I didn't sleep well after that. Every creak and rustle outside kept my eyes open. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear moving through the trees. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from the cold, and I could see faint tracks near the sidewall. Not animal tracks. Boots. Someone had been walking close to the cabin. The prints were fresh, pressed into the dirt like they'd been made only hours earlier. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe it was an old hunter passing by. Still, the idea of someone walking around while I was sleeping didn't sit right. I spent most of that day splitting some wood and walking with Rex along the creek. The water was thin and cold, flowing over smooth rocks. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, quiet but full of small sounds, the kind of sounds that blend into the background after a while. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, and it started raining lightly. I went back inside, made coffee, and lit another fire. Rex was restless. He kept pacing near the door, sniffing at the bottom of it, whining softly. I couldn't see anything outside. The rain made it hard to hear, but I could still feel that same uneasiness growing in me again. It got dark fast that night. When I finally went to bed, I made sure the door was locked and the flashlight was within reach. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again, this time to the sound of wood cracking. It wasn't from the stove. It was from outside. It sounded like someone stepping hard on a fallen branch. I froze and listened. Then, a second sound closer, just beyond the wall. Rex was already up, tail stiff, teeth showing slightly. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the window. For a second, I thought I saw something. A faint shape, like someone standing near the shed. The rain was still falling, making everything blurry, so I couldn't be sure. But I was certain now that it wasn't just an animal. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting near the fire with the flashlight in my hand. The rain eventually stopped, and the forest went silent again. By morning, I went outside to look. There were more footprints, wet, messy, moving around the shed and toward the trees. They circled the cabin twice before heading off into the woods. Whoever it was, they had been watching the cabin for a while. That realization hit me hard. I packed my things fast, but I didn't leave yet. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and I didn't want to drive through those roads half asleep. I decided I'd leave before dark. I tried to keep myself busy during the day, but I couldn't focus. Rex kept glancing toward the woods, his ears twitching. Around noon, I heard something metallic clatter behind the shed. I grabbed the knife and went to check, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. The ground was wet and soft. When I reached the back, the small metal latch from the shed door was lying on the ground. The door was slightly open. Inside, it was dark, smelled like old oil and rust. I stepped closer and noticed that some things had been moved around. Empty cans, tools, and an old lantern. Someone had been inside recently. That was enough for me. I decided to leave right then. I packed everything, threw it into the truck, and called for Rex. When I started the engine, I saw something in the trees ahead. A figure, dark, standing still between two pines. It wasn't close enough for me to see clearly, but I could tell it was a person. They didn't move, didn't step forward or back, just stood there. I pressed on the gas and didn't look back again. I drove until I reached the main road, where my hands finally stopped shaking. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. When I got to a small gas station, I parked and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. Rex rested his head on my lap, still alert but calmer than before. A week later, I called the property owner and told him what had happened. He sounded surprised but not shocked. He said a few locals had complained about people camping illegally in those woods, mostly drifters, maybe squatters. He said one of them had been caught last winter breaking into cabins, stealing food and blankets. The police found him half frozen a few miles from where I had stayed. That made everything fit. It wasn't anything supernatural, nothing mysterious. Just a desperate person trying to survive in the cold, moving around the woods, maybe looking for a place to stay the night. Still, knowing that someone was watching me while I slept, walking circles around my cabin in the dark, it stayed with me. Now, years later, I still think about that place. The sound of footsteps in the rain, the prints outside the window, the figure standing between the trees. I never went back there, never tried to see the cabin again. Every time I drive through Montana and see the tree lines stretching into the distance, I remember that silence, that feeling of being watched. I still love the woods, and I still take Rex out on long trips, but I don't stay in cabins anymore. I stick to places with other people nearby, where there's light, noise, and movement, because out there, in those dark stretches of forest, you don't need ghosts to feel fear. Sometimes all it takes is knowing that someone else is out there, breathing, watching, waiting, for you to realize how thin the walls of safety really are. It was late October 2014 when I decided to take a short break from everything. I'd been working long hours in a small construction company in Ohio, and my head was constantly buzzing from the noise and dust. A friend of mine, who knew I liked quiet places, mentioned a small cabin he used to rent years ago in northern Pennsylvania, near a lake surrounded by dense woods. He said the place was old, a little run down, but peaceful, perfect for someone who wanted to be alone for a few days. That was all I needed to hear. I packed my truck with a few days' worth of supplies: canned food, bottled water, tools, some old clothes, and a sleeping bag. My dog, a brown mixed breed named Max, jumped into the passenger seat like he knew exactly where we were heading. The drive took almost 7 hours. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already low. The road was rough, narrow, and full of fallen branches. My truck bounced and rattled the whole way. When I finally reached the cabin, I saw how isolated it really was. It sat about 50 yards from the lake, surrounded by tall pine and birch trees that blocked most of the light. The place looked older than I expected. Wooden planks darkened from years of rain and snow, the porch sagging slightly on one side, and a rusted tin roof that looked like it had been patched too many times. I stepped out and felt the cold air immediately. The smell of wet leaves and pine needles filled the air. Max ran off to sniff around, his paws crunching through the dried leaves. I walked to the front door and gave it a push. It stuck for a second before opening with a creaking sound. The inside was small and smelled faintly of mildew. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, an old wood stove, a single table, and a couple of wooden chairs. A narrow hallway led to a small bedroom and a tiny bathroom that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The windows were grimy but intact. I set my bags down, unpacked some things, and lit a few candles I brought. There was no electricity. The silence inside was heavy, not the comforting kind, but the kind that made you notice every little sound. I could hear the faint ticking of cooling metal from my truck outside, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. That first night, I cooked a can of beans on the stove and sat by the window eating while Max lay by the door. The light from the candle flickered on the walls, and I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Too quiet. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the sound of water gently moving somewhere beyond the trees. When I went to bed, I couldn't fall asleep easily. The mattress was old and lumpy, and I kept hearing faint noises, like twigs snapping outside or something brushing lightly against the cabin wall. I told myself it was probably animals, maybe deer or raccoons. Max, however, stayed alert for a long time. His ears perked, occasionally growling low under his breath. The next morning, I woke up to a cloudy sky and a layer of mist floating over the lake. I made some instant coffee on the stove and decided to take a walk with Max. The woods were beautiful but strange. Tall trees packed so close together that the light barely reached the ground. The silence was deep, broken only by my footsteps and the distant caw of a crow. About half a mile from the cabin, I found what looked like the remains of an old shack, maybe even older than the cabin. It was collapsed and covered in moss. I didn't go too close to it. It just didn't feel right. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. My truck door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it the night before because I double-checked the locks. I looked around. Nothing seemed stolen, but the glove box was open and the papers inside were scattered on the seat. Maybe I'd forgotten, I told myself. Still, it bothered me. That night, I decided to keep the lantern burning for a while. Max wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing near the door, sometimes staring at it like he heard something I didn't. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of leaves outside. It wasn't heavy like footsteps, but more like something being dragged slowly through the dirt. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited for a long time, heart beating so hard I could feel it in my neck. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably an animal again and tried to sleep. The next day, I found tracks behind the cabin. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I followed them a little, and they led toward the tree line before fading into the underbrush. That was the first time I felt truly uneasy. Someone had been here. Maybe a hunter, I thought. But then why come so close to the cabin? That afternoon, I chopped some wood for the stove and kept Max close. The clouds thickened, and by evening, rain started to fall. The wind picked up, and the sound of the rain on the tin roof filled the cabin. I sat by the stove with Max at my feet, trying to read an old magazine I found on the shelf. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside, like faint movements, but I told myself it was just the rain. When night came, the rain turned heavier. Water dripped from a leak in the corner of the ceiling. I was half asleep when I heard it again, a sound like slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. Max started barking, his body stiff and alert. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the window, but all I saw was my own reflection in the glass. The rain was too thick to see anything clearly outside. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything went silent again except for the rain. Then I heard something, a sharp metallic sound, like someone trying the handle on the back door. My whole body went cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Max was growling, teeth bared, staring toward the kitchen where the back door was. The handle jiggled again, softly this time. I slowly reached for the old hunting knife I'd brought. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The sound stopped again. After what felt like forever, I heard retreating steps fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped outside. The ground was soaked, the air heavy with the smell of wet dirt. Behind the cabin, near the door, there were fresh boot prints. They were deep and clear. Someone had been there right up against the door. I followed the prints a little way into the woods until they disappeared into the mud. That was enough for me. I packed everything back into the truck. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. The dark, rotting wood, the mist hanging over the lake, the stillness of the trees. It looked peaceful again, like nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew someone had been out there. On my way back down the dirt road, I stopped near where I'd seen that old shack. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to it. The ground around it was soft and disturbed, like someone had been digging there recently. There was a strong smell of rot. I didn't stay to look any closer. By the time I reached the main road, the rain had stopped and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched the whole time I was there. I never told anyone what happened, not even my friend who suggested the place. I just told him the cabin wasn't what I expected. To this day, I think about those footsteps, the hand on the door handle, the open truck door. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that. What scared me wasn't something supernatural. It was knowing that someone had been out there, maybe watching me from the trees, maybe waiting for the right moment to come inside. And that's what stays with me every time I think about that old cabin by the lake. How quiet it was, and how close someone must have been in that silence. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Montana. I had been working nonstop that year and needed a break from people, traffic, and screens. My dog, Rusty, a large mixed breed with thick brown fur and a calm but alert nature, was the only company I wanted. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was small, made of old pine logs, and sat at the edge of a narrow dirt road that twisted through the woods for about 15 miles before meeting the nearest highway. I had rented it from a retired forest ranger who told me it was quiet, isolated, and simple. That was all I needed to hear. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how silent the place felt. Not peaceful silence, just the kind that made your ears ring a little because there was nothing to fill the space. The cabin sat beside a small clearing with knee-high grass, surrounded by dense trees that looked like they'd been standing there for hundreds of years. Behind it was a narrow trail that led uphill toward the tree line. The nearest town, he had said, was about 45 minutes away if I drove fast. There was no cell signal once you got off the main road. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room with a small kitchen, a wooden table, a fireplace, and a narrow bed by the wall. The furniture smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin. There was a small shed about 50 feet behind the cabin, half sunk into the earth, where firewood and tools were stored. Rusty sniffed around every corner, his nails tapping lightly against the old floorboards. The first 2 days were calm. I hiked a little, cooked simple meals on the gas stove, and spent most evenings sitting outside watching the light fade through the trees. Rusty always stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. An owl, a cracking branch, the rustle of leaves. The nights got cold, and by the third evening, I had started using the fireplace. There was something comforting about the orange glow inside that cabin, especially when the wind pressed against the windows. On the fourth night, things began to feel off. It had been raining since morning, a steady, cold drizzle that soaked everything. I'd gone outside earlier to stack some firewood near the porch, and while doing that, I noticed footprints near the edge of the clearing, boot prints, medium-sized, maybe a man's. They were partly washed out from the rain, but they looked fresh, maybe from the night before. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. That detail stuck with me. I told myself it was probably from a hunter or maybe a hiker who had passed through. It wasn't hunting season yet, but people wandered these forests all the time. Still, I found myself glancing out the window more often that evening. The rain made everything blurry outside, and the forest looked darker than usual, almost heavy. Rusty stayed close, resting by the fire, but every now and then, he'd lift his head, ears perked, staring toward the window. By nightfall, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. Water dripped from the corners of the roof, and the wind carried that wet, earthy smell into the cabin. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of Rusty growling softly. It was a deep, low sound I'd rarely heard from him. He was standing by the door, his body tense, tail stiff, staring out the small front window. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dim, lit only by the dying fire. I went to the window and tried to look out, but the rain and darkness made it almost impossible to see anything. I couldn't tell if there was someone out there or if it was just the wind moving through the trees. Rusty didn't move. He stood there, growling under his breath for what felt like minutes. Eventually, he calmed down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, everything was soaked. Puddles had formed around the cabin, and a thin layer of mist hung low over the clearing. I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. There were more footprints. Not just one set this time, too. They led from the tree line toward the cabin and stopped about 10 feet from the porch. Then they turned back toward the woods. Whoever it was had come close. Too close. The prints weren't there the day before. I stood there for a long time, my breath visible in the cold air, staring at the pattern in the mud. I didn't know what to do. There was no phone signal, and I didn't want to drive through 15 miles of slippery road just because of footprints. So I decided to stay, but I made sure all windows were latched and the door was bolted. That day felt longer than usual. The rain stopped around noon, but the clouds stayed thick. I tried reading, chopping more wood, doing anything to distract myself. Rusty followed me everywhere, and every time I stepped outside, his eyes scanned the tree line. By evening, I noticed something else strange. The shed door behind the cabin, one that I always kept shut, was slightly open. At first, I thought the wind might have blown it loose, but when I walked up to it, I saw faint muddy fingerprints on the edge of the door. The inside of the shed was dark and smelled of wet wood. I didn't go in. I just shut the door, dropped the latch, and went back inside, locking everything again. My hands were shaking a little. That night, I kept the lantern on beside my bed. Rusty didn't sleep much either. He kept pacing between the door and the window, ears flicking at every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a knock or a howl. It was the sound of boots crunching on wet gravel, faint but steady, somewhere behind the cabin. I froze. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again. Closer this time. Rusty began barking, loud and sharp, his body pressed against the door. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept near the fireplace and stood there, not sure what I was planning to do with it. I could hear movement outside, slow and deliberate, like someone walking in circles around the cabin. Then silence. Nothing but Rusty's breathing and the creak of the roof in the wind. After what felt like hours, I finally heard the footsteps fade toward the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sky began to turn gray, I opened the door carefully. The ground outside was covered with prints, fresh, deep, and clear. Whoever it was had walked right up to the window near my bed and stood there for some time. I could see the heel marks where they had shifted their weight, facing inside. That morning, I packed everything fast. I loaded my backpack, threw what was left of my food and water into the truck, and called Rusty inside. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. The stillness of it suddenly felt different. Not peaceful, just empty and watchful. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing, watching me leave. When I reached the main road, I stopped for a few minutes, just sitting there with my hands on the wheel. Rusty rested his head on my arm, calm again. I realized then that if I'd ignored his growling that first night, I might have woken up to something much worse. Later, when I told the ranger who owned the cabin about what happened, he said people sometimes wander those woods, hunters, drifters, or others just living off the land. Some keep their distance, but not all. He looked uneasy when I mentioned the shed door, said something about how tools sometimes went missing there. I never went back after that. The whole week played over in my head for months. The rain, the prints, the sound of footsteps circling in the dark. It wasn't until long after that I realized what scared me most. It wasn't that someone had been there. It was that they hadn't tried to come in. Whoever it was had just stood there, watching. And that thought still follows me every time the night goes quiet and the dog suddenly lifts his head, staring at nothing in particular. It had been 8 months since my ex-husband, Mark, passed away. We hadn't spoken much in the years after our divorce, but his death hit me harder than I expected. He was found in his cabin deep in northern Montana, a place he built himself after we separated. The police said it was a heart attack. He was only 51. I was 47 then, and even though our marriage had ended badly, I still couldn't shake off the thought of him dying alone out there. A few weeks after the funeral, his sister called me and said there were still some of my things in the cabin. Old photos, a few of my books, maybe a box or two from when we were still together. She asked if I wanted to come get them before she cleared the place out. I didn't want to, but I said yes. Felt like something I needed to do. I drove out there in late October of 2022. The drive took almost 6 hours from where I lived in Missoula. The highway was quiet, lined with yellowing trees, their leaves already starting to fall. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind kept pushing against the car like it was trying to turn me around. I stopped once at a small gas station outside Kalispell for coffee, and then kept going. Mark's cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest near a lake called Bear Hollow. It was the kind of place you could disappear in. When I pulled up to the gravel driveway, I saw the cabin through the trees, small, dark brown wood, the roof slightly sagging on one side. There was still a tarp covering a stack of firewood, and the metal chimney was stained black from years of smoke. His old green pickup truck was gone. The police had probably taken it. The air was colder there, sharper. I could smell the damp pine and old wood the second I stepped out. Everything around the cabin felt frozen in time. The grass was tall and patchy, the porch steps warped. A few tools were left leaning against the shed like someone had just put them down and never came back. I unlocked the door using the spare key his sister had given me. The smell hit me first. Musty, like wet wood and stale air. I stood there for a few seconds, just letting my eyes adjust. The inside was almost exactly how I remembered it from years ago. Small, cluttered, but organized in that strange way Mark always liked things. The old sofa still faced the fireplace. A few mugs were on the kitchen counter. A folded blanket sat on the armchair. It looked like he could have been outside chopping wood, ready to walk back in any minute. There was a thin layer of dust on everything. I ran my finger along the counter and saw the gray line it left behind. On the dining table, there were papers scattered. Some receipts, a few letters, and a notebook that looked newer than the rest. I picked it up. The first few pages were full of lists, supplies, grocery notes, sketches of small woodworking projects. But as I flipped further, the handwriting got messier. There were notes about noises at night, missing tools, and footprints around the cabin. He'd written that he thought someone was watching the place. I didn't think much of it at first. Mark had always been a bit paranoid living alone in the woods. But as I read more, it started to make me uneasy. He had written dates and times. Things like heard something outside again, 2:14 a.m., or tracks near shed not mine. The last entry was from 2 days before he died. It just said, "If something happens, check the crawl space." That line stuck in my head. I closed the notebook and set it down, trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just him being dramatic. I started gathering up the boxes with my old things. Books, a few photo albums, some clothes. Every sound outside made me tense. The wind against the windows, branches scraping the roof. It all felt louder than it should have been. The sky had turned gray and heavy by the time I finished packing. I was about to leave when I remembered the notebook again. The crawl space. It was behind the fireplace, a small wooden hatch on the floor that led underneath the cabin. I knelt down and tried to lift it. It stuck at first, then creaked open with a puff of cold, stale air. I shone my phone's flashlight inside. It was dark and narrow, full of cobwebs and dust. I could see old insulation and the bottom beams of the house. But near the far end, there was something odd. A dark shape, maybe a tarp or a blanket. I hesitated, but something in me pushed forward. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crawled halfway inside. The ground was cold and damp. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a blanket. It was a duffel bag. I pulled it toward me, and the zipper was half open. Inside were tools, a hammer, a hunting knife, duct tape, and a small notebook. My stomach tightened. The smaller notebook was wrapped in a piece of plastic. I opened it carefully. Inside were pages of handwriting, but it wasn't Mark's. It was someone else's, rough, uneven letters written in pencil. The notes talked about watching the cabin, about him leaving food outside sometimes, about hiding when the lights came on. My heart started pounding. I backed out of the crawl space and sat there on the floor, staring at the bag. The thought hit me like a punch. Someone had been living under the cabin, watching him, maybe for months. I went outside and walked around the back of the cabin. The ground near the crawl space vent had marks, small footprints, maybe from bare feet, leading toward the trees. There was an old blanket stuffed under a bush and a few empty cans. Whoever it was had been living right there. I locked up the cabin and sat in my car for a long time before starting it. The woods felt different now, heavier. I kept thinking about how Mark had written that someone was watching him, and how no one believed it. Maybe he'd seen whoever it was. Maybe they'd been breaking in at night, and maybe that's what really happened to him. When I got back home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the crawl space, about how close someone had been to him all that time. I called the local sheriff's office the next morning and told them what I found. They sent someone out there the next day. 2 days later, one of the officers called me back. He said they found signs that someone had been living under the cabin, just like I said, blankets, food wrappers, old clothes, but they hadn't found the person. He told me it looked like whoever it was had been there a long time, probably coming and going without anyone noticing. They never found whoever it was. A few weeks after that, the cabin was sold to a new owner. I heard they planned to tear it down and build something new. I never went back. Sometimes, though, when I think about Mark, I picture him sitting in that cabin, eating dinner, reading his book, completely unaware that someone was lying in the dirt just a few feet below him, listening to every sound he made. I think about that line he wrote, "If something happens, check the crawl space." He must have known something wasn't right. And the worst part is, I'll never know what he saw or what happened in those final days before he died. But I know one thing, he wasn't alone out there. Not for a long time. It was late September 2014 when I took the ranger post at a remote section of Clearwater National Park in northern Montana. I was 31 then, still trying to piece my life together after leaving a rough city job and a failed relationship behind. The ranger station was a small, weathered cabin sitting about 6 miles from the nearest paved road. It was surrounded by dense pine forest, rolling hills, and a long valley that ran down to a half-dry riverbed. The area was quiet, almost too quiet, and that silence was what I thought I wanted. I told myself I needed it. The cabin itself was simple. One main room, a narrow bedroom, a wood stove, a desk, and a two-way radio for check-ins. I had a small generator outside, which I only ran for an hour or two in the evening to power a light and charge my phone. There was no cell signal, of course, just static if I tried. The log walls were old and uneven, the kind where you could see the daylight in the thin cracks if you looked close enough. The air always smelled faintly of resin, damp soil, and burnt pine wood. My days were long but predictable. I'd wake around 6, heat up water for instant coffee, and step outside into the chill air. The mornings were cold even then, and frost gathered on the grass. I'd walk along the dirt trail to check the animal traps we used for tagging or check on the perimeter signs warning hikers about bear activity. Sometimes I wouldn't see another human being for weeks. The solitude wasn't hard at first, it felt like freedom. But after the second month, the quiet started pressing in on me. The nights were what got strange. The park seemed to come alive after sunset, but not in a way I could easily explain. You'd hear things, snaps, distant thuds, brush rustling. Normal stuff, I told myself. Animals, deer mostly, sometimes elk. But every so often, I'd hear something that didn't fit. Not the call of an animal, not a human voice, but something heavy moving at a pace that didn't match the usual wildlife. Sometimes it sounded like someone circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if counting the steps around it. I'd step outside with my flashlight, my boots crunching on the dirt. The beam of light would cut through the mist, hitting the treeline where shadows twisted and flickered. But there was never anything there, just the forest standing still, the air holding its breath. The first few times it happened, I brushed it off. Wind, maybe, or an animal moving strangely. But as the days got shorter, it happened more often. One night, around mid-October, I was finishing my field notes at the desk. The rain had been coming down for hours, steady and thick, the sound drumming on the metal roof like thousands of small stones. My generator had already shut off, and the only light came from the small oil lamp on the desk. I heard what I thought was a knock. Not on the door, but on the wall behind me. A single, dull thump. It was followed by another, a few seconds later, this one lower down, near the base of the wall. I froze in my chair, listening. The rain muffled most sounds, but I could still make out faint, irregular scraping. It stopped after maybe a minute. I stood, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out onto the small porch. The rain instantly soaked through my jacket. I swung the light around the cabin's side, scanning the ground. The mud was thick and uneven, but I saw footprints, boots, not animal tracks, leading from the tree-line toward the cabin. Then they stopped a few feet from the wall, right where I'd heard the noise. They didn't lead away. No returning prints, no sign of where the person went. Just ended there. I stayed outside for a long time, checking around the back and along the path, but I didn't see anyone. When I finally went inside, I double-checked the door lock and pushed a chair under the handle. The next morning, I went out early, following the tracks again. They'd partly filled with rain, but the direction was clear. They came straight from the woods. I followed them for maybe 20 yards until they disappeared into the thick brush. I kept walking, scanning the ground, but all I found was an old, half-collapsed hunting blind made of branches and camo netting. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was rotting and the fabric torn, but something about it felt off, like it had been disturbed recently. There was a faint impression of where someone might have been sitting, maybe even within the past few days. I radioed it in that afternoon just to log it, but didn't make a big deal of it. The other rangers at the main station probably wouldn't have cared much. Trespassers, poachers, drifters, we got them sometimes. Still, the unease stayed with me. A week later, I woke up before dawn. It was still dark, and the air inside the cabin felt colder than usual. I could smell the dampness coming through the wood. I sat up and noticed something faint on the window, the kind of condensation you get from breath. The glass was fogged up from the outside, not the inside. My first thought was that maybe an animal brushed up against it, but then I saw it clearly. A handprint. The fingers were long. The print smeared like someone had dragged their hand down the glass slowly. My chest tightened. I stepped closer, feeling my pulse in my ears. It was definitely human. The marks were fresh, and the moisture was still beating down the glass. When daylight came, I went outside to look for prints again. Nothing this time. The rain had stopped during the night, but the ground around the cabin was untouched. It was like whoever or whatever had been there knew exactly how to move without leaving a trace. Over the next few nights, I barely slept. Every small sound set me on edge. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching. I stopped turning off the lamp at night. I kept the flashlight in my hand even in bed. Then came the night that finally broke me. It was early November, cold enough that the rain had turned to sleet. The wind was strong, moaning through the cracks in the logs. I was sitting by the stove, trying to write in my logbook, when I heard the door creak. Not just rattle from the wind, an actual creak like the wood shifting under pressure. I froze. Then came the slow sound of the latch moving. My stomach dropped. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the door, but it looked normal. I stood, every part of me tight, and walked closer. The latch was slightly bent, just barely off alignment, like someone had tried to push it open. I backed away, turned off the lantern, and crouched down behind the desk. I stayed there, listening. Minutes passed. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps on the porch. Not animal steps, heavy, careful boots again. The boards creaked once, then twice. Then silence. I stayed there until dawn, barely breathing. When I finally opened the door, the first light of morning showed the prints again. Fresh, deep in the wet wood. Whoever had been there stood for a long time just outside, facing the door. I lasted one more night. After that, I packed up and left before sunset, drove the dirt trail until I reached the main ranger post, and told them I wasn't going back. They logged my resignation without much question. Months later, I heard that another ranger took over the cabin. He lasted less than 2 weeks before asking to be transferred out. They eventually shut down that outpost completely, citing unsafe access conditions during bad weather. I don't know who it was out there or why they watched that cabin. Maybe a squatter, a poacher, or someone hiding out in the forest. But whoever they were, they knew the woods better than I ever could. Sometimes I still dream about that handprint on the glass, the way it trailed down slowly, like the person knew I was watching from inside. And even now, years later, I still can't decide what scared me more. The idea that someone was out there, or the idea that they might still be. It was late October, 2019, when I decided to take a short trip out to a small cabin I'd rented in northern Montana, far from the town, deep in a wooded valley near the edge of an old logging trail. I'd been working long hours that month, and I wanted some time away from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. I just wanted quiet. The cabin was an old structure, probably from the 1970s, with weathered wooden walls, a tin roof, and a narrow porch that looked out toward a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. I drove out there in my old pickup, the back filled with groceries, a few tools, and some firewood. The drive took me nearly 6 hours from Billings, and by the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting orange light through the trees. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was rough and uneven, full of ruts and rocks that made my tires crunch and skid. The forest on both sides was dense, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. When I parked beside the cabin, the air felt colder than I expected. There was no wind, no sound, just that deep kind of silence that settles over empty woods. I stepped out and stretched my legs. The ground was damp, scattered with pine needles. The cabin itself looked rough but solid, a single-room layout with a small attached kitchen and an outhouse a few yards behind. There was an old generator on the side, but I didn't bother testing it. I'd brought a lantern and a few candles, planning to keep things simple. That first night was calm. I made a small fire in the stove and cooked some canned soup. I sat by the fire, the wood popping softly, and read for a while. Outside, the dark was so complete that even the light from the lantern barely reached beyond the window. I remember stepping out once before bed to breathe the night air. The forest felt alive, not noisy, but watchful. You could feel something about those woods, as if they had their own quiet presence. The next morning, I went out to explore the area. I followed an old trail that wound deeper into the woods. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and bits of old, rusted machinery, maybe leftovers from logging decades ago. A few miles in, I found the remains of what looked like an old hunting shack, just a foundation and a few beams still standing. Everything smelled of earth and damp wood. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, gray and heavy. I turned back before it started raining. When I reached the cabin again, the sky had darkened, and I could hear distant thunder. I went inside, set my lantern on the table, and lit the fire. As the rain started tapping against the roof, I felt that quiet satisfaction of being somewhere far away, with no one around, nothing to do but listen to the weather. But that calm didn't last long. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound outside, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps over wet leaves. I lay still, listening. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. The rain had stopped, but the sound wasn't the dripping of water. It was steady, slow. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something rooting around near the woodpile. But it didn't stop. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. The sound paused, then there was a faint scrape against the wall, near the window. I stayed in bed, not moving, watching the dim orange glow from the dying fire flicker across the ceiling. My heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my ears. After a minute, the noise faded away. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was muddy, soft enough to hold prints. Near the side wall, under the window, I saw something that didn't look like animal tracks. They were human boot prints. The pattern was deep and clear. Whoever it was had walked around the entire cabin. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I checked the door latch and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing looked broken. Still, I felt that uneasy awareness, the kind that makes the air heavier. I spent the rest of the morning keeping myself busy, chopping wood, tidying up inside, anything to stop thinking about the tracks. By afternoon, I told myself it was probably some hunter passing through. Maybe someone lost, just walking the perimeter out of curiosity. That night, though, it happened again. I woke around 2 in the morning to that same sound, the crunching of steps outside, slow and careful, as if whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. I sat up in bed and listened. The noise came closer this time, stopping near the porch. Then I heard a soft creak, the old boards of the porch bending under weight. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed and turned it on, but the beam barely stretched through the window. I didn't see anything out there, just the faint reflection of the trees. I sat there for what felt like an hour, gripping the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I turned it off and just sat in the dark until the first light of morning started to creep in. When I stepped outside, there were more footprints, clearer this time. They led from the edge of the clearing to the porch, then around the side of the cabin again. They weren't old either. The soil was still soft where the prints sank in. That day, I decided I'd had enough. I packed some of my things, loaded the truck, and planned to head out before night. But the old road had turned to a mess from the rain, deep, slick mud that made my tires spin. After trying twice, I realized I wasn't getting out that day. I'd have to stay one more night. The air turned colder by sunset. The forest looked darker than before, and the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and kept the lantern burning low. I didn't even bother reading or cooking. I just sat on the edge of the bed, waiting, listening to the wind outside. Around midnight, the sound came back again. Slow, steady steps circling the cabin. Then I heard a dull thud, like something hitting the door. Once, then again. I froze, staring at the door, half expecting it to open. Didn't. After a long silence, I heard the faintest sound of breathing close, right on the other side of the wall. Then nothing. Absolute stillness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tensed. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside, and the first thing I noticed was that the footprints were back. But now they were right up against the door, as if someone had stood there for a long time. I followed them a little way into the trees, maybe 30 feet, before they just stopped. No turn, no break, no other direction. They just ended in the middle of the clearing, like whoever made them had vanished or turned around without leaving a trace. That morning, I didn't waste time. I packed everything, started the truck, and kept pressing the gas until the tires caught enough traction to climb the hill. The road was rough and slippery, but I didn't care. I just kept going. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway hours later. My hands were shaking, and my mouth felt dry the whole drive back. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone much about it. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked the property listing again. It turned out that cabin had been empty for years before being listed online. No caretaker, no nearby houses for miles. The thought that someone else had been out there, walking around that place in the middle of the night, still makes me feel uneasy. Maybe it was just someone living off the grid, or maybe some drifter who noticed the light and got curious. I'll never know. But I do know this. I've never been back to a cabin since then, and I never will. Every time I think about that night, I can still hear that slow crunch of footsteps circling the cabin, the sound of someone who knew I was awake, listening. It was the summer of 2011, and I was 28 when I decided to build a small cabin deep in the woods outside a quiet town in northern Washington. I'd been living in the city for years, working a job that paid well but drained me every day. I wanted space, quiet, and something that felt like mine. I bought 2 acres of wooded land off an old logging road, surrounded by pines so tall they seemed to trap the wind itself. I didn't have much experience building anything beyond basic carpentry, but I was determined to do it myself, piece by piece, alone. By late September, I had cleared a patch big enough for a single-room cabin, maybe 15 by 20 feet. The air was already starting to cool by then, and rain had started to show up more often. The first few weeks of work were slow, hauling lumber from the small trailer, setting up basic framing, hammering through long days until my arms ached. I'd sleep in my truck at night, curled up in the back seat under a heavy blanket, the smell of sawdust and damp earth thick in the air. That one night, the night that still sticks with me, came after a long, exhausting day. It had been raining all afternoon, the kind of steady, soaking rain that doesn't let up, just keeps falling like it's got nowhere else to go. My boots were caked in mud, and the ground around the cabin site had turned to a slick mess. I'd been trying to get the roof panels secured before the storm got worse, but I ran out of daylight. The sky turned dark fast, so dark I could barely see the tree line anymore. The forest around me had gone quiet, except for the sound of rain hammering the unfinished roof and dripping from the branches above. I decided to stay the night inside the cabin shell instead of walking back to the truck. The walls were up, the roof half done, but it was enough to give some shelter. I had my camping stove, a flashlight, and a folding chair. I set the chair near the small opening I'd left for the door and lit the stove just to warm my hands. The rain kept coming harder, beating against the roof so loud I could barely hear anything else. The air smelled of wet pine and mud, and there was that deep, earthy chill that gets into your clothes and skin. At one point, I stepped outside to check the tarp I'd tied over the lumber pile. The beam from my flashlight cut through the rain, but visibility was terrible. Everything blurred together in the downpour. The ground was soft, and my boots sank deep into it. I tightened the tarp ropes, adjusted a few boards that had slipped, and turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something. There were tracks leading from the side of the cabin toward the trees, deep, uneven prints in the mud. At first, I thought they were mine, but they didn't match the tread of my boots. These were different, wider, heavier. The rain had started to wash them out, but I could still make out the shape. Someone had been walking near the cabin, maybe earlier in the evening when I was working on the roof. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone from the area. There were a few old cabins a few miles down the road. Maybe somebody had wandered too far. I didn't think much more of it at that moment, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness it gave me. I went back inside and tried to get some rest. I shut off the flashlight to save the batteries and sat in the dark, listening to the storm. The sound of rain on the metal roof was constant, steady, but every now and then I thought I heard something else, something faint underneath it, a dull thump or maybe a splash of mud. I tried to ignore it, blaming my tired mind for making things up. Hours seemed to drag by. I don't remember dozing off, but I must have. I woke up later to silence. Not total silence, but quieter than before. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the wind had picked up, brushing against the loose boards. It was sometime past midnight. I sat up, my back sore from the chair, and looked out through the open doorway. My flashlight was still near the stove, and I switched it on, pointing it outside. There were fresh footprints in the mud again, closer this time. I could see them clearly, maybe 5 or 6 feet from where I sat. They circled near the lumber pile and trailed off behind the cabin toward the trees. They weren't mine, I knew that much. The rain hadn't been hard enough to wash them away yet. I felt my chest tighten. My first thought was that someone had been out there watching while I slept. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept by my bag and stepped out slowly. The air was colder now, and the drizzle made a soft pattering sound against the leaves. My flashlight beam moved across the trees, the grass, the mud, but I didn't see anyone. The forest was just dark and wet and still. I stayed out there a long time, maybe 15 minutes, scanning the woods, listening. Nothing moved except the rain. When I finally went back inside, I pushed the chair against the opening and sat down again, hatchet in hand. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe the tracks were older than I thought. But I couldn't relax. Every sound made me flinch. The creak of a board, the tap of water from the roof, the wind brushing through the cracks in the wall. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes fixed on that doorway, waiting for something I couldn't even name. When daylight finally came, the rain had stopped. The forest looked completely different. Quiet, calm, harmless even. The tracks were still there, but they were faint now, sinking into the mud. I walked around the cabin slowly, following them as far as I could. They led to the tree line and then disappeared into the thick undergrowth. No sign of anyone. No broken branches, no dropped tools, nothing. That morning, I packed up everything I had, loaded it into the truck, and drove into town. I bought a cheap lock for the cabin door frame and a trail camera from the local hardware store. When I got back, I installed both before leaving again. I didn't come back for 3 weeks. When I finally returned, the woods were colder. Autumn had rolled in fully, and most of the leaves had turned and fallen. I checked the trail camera first thing. It had taken a few dozen photos, mostly deer, some raccoons, the usual. But in one of the night shots, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a man. He was standing between 2 trees, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. His head was slightly turned toward it, like he was watching. It was hard to make out details, but he looked tall, wearing a hood or maybe a hat. The timestamp said 2:43 a.m., the same night I'd stayed there through the rain. I never told anyone about it. I didn't even show the photo. I deleted it and took the camera down that same day. I finished the cabin before winter, but I never stayed another night there. I drive up during the day, work for a few hours, then leave before dark. I kept the place mostly as a storage shed after that, stocked with tools and extra lumber. By spring, I sold the land to an older couple who wanted a summer retreat. They asked me about the unfinished state of the cabin, and I told them I'd lost interest, that it was too much work. They didn't ask more, and I didn't offer anything else. Sometimes, when it rains hard at night, I still think about that place. The sound of water hitting the half-built roof, the thick mud under my boots, the quiet forest surrounding me. And I still remember those tracks in the dark, the ones that kept appearing no matter how much it rained. I don't know who that man was, or what he wanted out there miles from any road. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he had been living somewhere close all along. But I know this much. The woods hold on to things, and sometimes you don't realize how close something or someone has been until you look back later. That was the last time I ever built anything alone in the woods. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to take a solo weekend trip into the woods outside of northern Idaho. I was 29 then, tired of my job, tired of city noise, and just needed quiet for a few days. I'd rented a small cabin online that looked simple but clean, one of those old log cabins that people used to live in before the land got sold off for recreation. The photos showed a wood stove, a bed, and a creek nearby. That's all I needed. I packed my truck on Friday morning and drove out of Spokane before sunrise. The highway was mostly empty that time of morning. By the time I got off the paved road and onto the dirt one, it was past noon. The last few miles were rough. Potholes, narrow turns, overgrown grass scraping the sides of the truck. There were no other cabins around, no fences, no signs. Just forest. Pine trees thick as walls on both sides. It felt like I'd gone too far out, but my phone still had just enough signal to confirm the GPS dot was near the right spot. When I finally reached the clearing, I almost didn't see the cabin at first. It sat low and half covered by brush. The wood darkened from years of weather. The roof looked uneven, a few patches of tin nailed on top. The door leaned slightly to one side. It was older than the photos had shown, way older. It didn't look like it had been rented in years. Still, I'd come all that way, and the key was supposedly in a lockbox under the porch. The first step creaked under my boot. The smell hit me before I even opened the door. Old wood, damp air, and something faintly sour, like stale water or rotting leaves. The inside was darker than I expected, even with the daylight coming through the window. There was a bed frame with an old mattress, a small table, a chair missing one leg, and a rusted stove in the corner. The walls were stained from water leaks, and the floor was littered with dry pine needles that must have blown in through the cracks. I spent most of that first day cleaning. I swept out the floor with a stick broom I found behind the door, checked for mice, and laid my sleeping bag on top of the mattress instead of using it. I got a small fire going in the stove before sunset and cooked some canned food. The woods outside went quiet after dark. Completely quiet. No wind, no insects, not even the creak sound I'd expected. Just the steady ticking of cooling metal from the stove and the occasional popping of old wood shifting somewhere in the cabin walls. I tried reading for a while with my flashlight, but I couldn't focus. The silence pressed on my ears. Every small noise, a drip, a creak, a shifting sound from under the floor, made my body tense. I told myself it was just animals, mice, maybe a raccoon. But still, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, mostly pines and firs. There were fallen branches everywhere and old stumps that looked like they'd been cut decades ago. About 100 yards behind the cabin, I found the creek. It was barely moving, just a thin stream of brownish water with leaves floating in it. Nearby, half buried under roots, I found something strange. The frame of an old, rusted bicycle, almost eaten by the dirt. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I kept walking until I found a small shed further back, half collapsed and covered in moss. The door was missing, but inside there were some old tools. A shovel, a cracked lantern, and a metal bucket. The shovel handle looked newer, though. Maybe someone had been around recently. That thought made me uneasy. The cabin didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but the shed looked like someone had been using it. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that I was sure hadn't been there earlier. The broom I'd left leaning against the wall was lying flat on the floor, a few feet away from where I'd left it. Could have fallen over, maybe from the wind or from vibration when I walked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was odd. The cabin wasn't drafty enough for that. The second night was worse. I fell asleep sometime after midnight, the fire burning low, when I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was pitch black, and for a moment I thought it was just a dream. Then I heard it, slow, soft steps outside, circling the cabin. The crunch of dry pine needles underfoot. Then silence. Then more steps. I stayed completely still. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached for the flashlight but stopped halfway, afraid that whoever or whatever was outside might see the light through the window. The steps moved to the front of the cabin and stopped near the porch. Then the floorboards creaked. I held my breath. The sound lasted only a few seconds. Then it was gone. No door movement, no more steps. Just quiet. I waited for a long time before I dared move again. When I finally looked outside through the small gap in the curtain, there was nothing. Just darkness and the outline of trees. The next morning, I went out to check. There were footprints in the dirt by the porch. Not boot prints, just the shape of shoes, fairly big ones, maybe a man's size. I walked around the clearing, looking for more, but they stopped near the tree line. Whoever it was, they had been there. I couldn't tell if it was last night or earlier, but the prints looked fresh. I packed my things that morning, ready to leave, but when I went to start my truck, the engine wouldn't turn. The battery was dead. I tried again and again, but nothing. I checked the hood. Everything looked fine. No loose wires, nothing chewed. I kept thinking about those footprints. It didn't feel like a coincidence. I hadn't left the lights on, and the truck was only a few years old. With no phone signal and the next house miles away, I had no choice but to stay one more night. I brought my hatchet inside that evening and kept it next to me. I made sure the door was locked with the metal latch and pushed the table against it just in case. The firelight flickered across the walls, and I watched the shadows stretch across the floor until my eyes burned from exhaustion. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. I didn't move. The air was colder than before. I could hear something faint outside. Not footsteps this time, but a dragging sound, like something being pulled slowly through the dirt. It circled the cabin once, then stopped near the side window. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy breathing, almost steady, like someone trying not to make noise. Then the handle on the door rattled, just once, then again, not loud, but enough that I could hear the metal scrape. I didn't move. The table pressed against the door shifted slightly from the pressure. I kept my eyes on it until the sound stopped. After that, there was nothing. No breathing, no dragging. Just silence that lasted until morning. When daylight finally came, I opened the door slowly. There were fresh marks in the dirt, dragged lines leading from the porch to the trees, like something heavy had been pulled away. The footprints were still there too, overlapping in different directions. I followed them just far enough to see that they went deeper into the forest, then turned back. By noon, a forest ranger truck came down the road. I waved them down right away. They said they'd been doing rounds because there had been reports of a man seen wandering around the area, breaking into hunting shacks and taking food. They said he'd been living in the woods for months, maybe longer. When I told them what happened, they checked the area around the cabin. They found a small camp a few hundred yards away, hidden behind some trees, a tarp, some cans, a sleeping bag, and a few car batteries wired together. One of them matched the make of mine. He'd taken my truck battery during the night. They took my report, jumped my truck, and told me to head back to town. I didn't argue. As I drove down that long dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The trees closed in behind me, and the cabin disappeared from sight. I've been in plenty of quiet places since then, but none have ever felt as silent as that cabin. Not the kind of quiet that relaxes you, the kind that listens back. It was late November of 2018, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Montana. The trees were bare, the air sharp and dry, and the daylight never seemed to last long enough. I had been planning this hunting trip for months, mostly as an excuse to get away from everything: work, noise, people. I wanted silence, the kind that hums in your ears after hours of being alone. I had rented a small old cabin miles off the main road, the kind that used to belong to trappers or loggers decades ago. It was far from the nearest town, and there wasn't any cell service for at least 10 miles around. The cabin sat at the edge of a wide clearing surrounded by tall pine and spruce trees. It had a single room, a rusty old wood stove, a table that leaned slightly to one side, and a small cot pushed up against the wall. The air inside smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. Maybe dried out nails in the walls or the iron stove itself. There was no electricity, so I brought a small lantern and some batteries. I had also packed a few cans of food, a hunting rifle, and a small cooler filled with ice and meat from the first day's hunt. The first 2 days went well. I spent most of the daylight hiking through the woods, tracking elk and deer trails that wound between thick brush and icy streams. The cold air burned my lungs, but it felt good, clean, real. Every sound out there carried farther than you'd expect. The snapping of branches, the crunch of frost under my boots, even my own breathing. At night, I'd light a small fire in the stove, eat, and sit by the window with a mug of coffee, looking out at the trees. The nights were dark, darker than anywhere I'd been before, and the silence was so heavy it almost felt like it pressed against my ears. By the third night, the quiet had started to feel different. Not peaceful, just empty. I noticed little things that I hadn't before. A few times I thought I heard movement outside when the fire burned low. It wasn't close, more like something walking through the woods at a distance. Soft but steady steps. I told myself it was deer or elk moving through the brush. But sometimes the noise stopped too suddenly, like it was listening. I'd get up, stand by the window, and stare into the black woods, but all I could see were the faint outlines of trees against the starlight. That evening, I sat at the table cleaning my rifle when I noticed something strange outside. The ground around the clearing was covered in a thin layer of frost, but near the treeline, there were patches where the frost looked disturbed, like something had walked around the edge of the clearing in a half circle. I went out to check, but by the time I got there, I couldn't make out much. The soil was frozen, and the footprints were shallow, scattered, almost human but uneven. I tried not to overthink it and went back inside, locking the door out of habit. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist a little. About 30 feet from the cabin, there was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, probably deer, but picked clean and stacked neatly, almost like someone had set them there on purpose. They looked old, but still, something about how they were arranged didn't feel right. I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging in front of me, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hunter before me had done it, maybe coyotes dragged them together, but deep down I knew that wasn't how nature worked. That day, I didn't go far from the cabin. I stayed near the clearing, checked my traps, and chopped some wood to keep busy. Every now and then, I'd glance back toward the trees, expecting to see movement, but there was nothing, just stillness. Around dusk, a light snow began to fall, soft and quiet. I went inside early, built up the fire, and tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. It must have been around 1 a.m. when I woke up to a sound, faint but clear. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was metal scraping against metal. I lay still, my heart pounding, listening. The sound came again, this time from the side of the cabin near the door. It was like someone was dragging something metallic slowly along the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, my hands trembling a little, and aimed the light toward the sound. The scraping stopped. I stood there in silence for what felt like minutes, the only sound my breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. When I finally stepped closer to the window and shined the light outside, there was nothing, just falling snow and the faint outline of trees. I tried to tell myself it was an animal brushing against the wall, maybe a raccoon or porcupine, but the sound had been deliberate, slow, steady. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I went outside to check. Along the wall near the door, I found several long, thin marks running across the wood, like something sharp had been dragged along it. The edges of the scratches were fresh, lighter than the rest of the weathered boards. I followed the trail around the cabin but found nothing else. No footprints, no signs of an animal. The snow around the cabin was mostly untouched except for my own tracks. That was when I decided I'd had enough. I started packing my things, planning to leave by afternoon. The silence felt heavier that day, like the woods were holding their breath. But just before I was ready to go, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Out near the edge of the clearing, there was a figure far off, standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was another hunter, but it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, still half hidden behind a pine. I squinted, trying to make out more, but the distance and the snow made it hard to see. Then, without a sound, it stepped back and disappeared into the trees. I stood there frozen for a long time, staring at the spot where it had been. Every instinct in me said to get in the truck and drive. So I did. I loaded everything up as fast as I could, threw my gear into the back seat, and started down the narrow dirt road that wound back toward the highway. The snow was falling harder now, thick and wet, sticking to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The road was rough and my tires slid more than once. About half a mile down, I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. Someone was standing on the side of the road behind me, right where the trees started again, just standing there in the falling snow. I couldn't make out their face, just the shape of them, tall and still. I didn't slow down. I drove faster, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away, where the snowplows had cleared the pavement and the cell signal came back. I never went back for the rest of my gear. A week later, I got a call from the cabin owner. He said he went out to check the place and found the door wide open. The wood near the handle splintered, like it had been forced. He said some of the walls were scratched up, and the ashes in the stove were scattered all over the floor, like something had been rummaging around inside. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just told him I wasn't coming back. Even now, years later, when I think about that trip, I can still picture that clearing, that shape standing in the snow, motionless. I've gone hunting plenty of times since then, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods. Whatever or whoever was out there that night wasn't an animal. It was something human. And the worst part is knowing that someone else might go stay in that same cabin, thinking they're alone, not realizing they're being watched from the trees. It was October of 2017 when I decided to take a short break from my job in Birmingham and drive up north to a remote cabin I'd rented near a small village called Lazenby, somewhere deep in the countryside of Cumbria, England. I was 31 back then, working long shifts in construction, and my head was constantly pounding with the noise of drills and hammers. I just wanted silence for a few days, no coworkers, no traffic, no phone calls, just peace. The cabin wasn't much when I first saw it. It sat on a small slope surrounded by a thick wall of trees, mostly pines and birches, so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. The roof was rusty tin, and one of the windows had a crack running across the middle. Still, it was clean inside. A single bed, a small table, a stove, and an old oil lamp. That was enough for me. The nearest house was about 2 miles away, and there was a small creek behind the cabin where I could get fresh water. It was perfect. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no cars, no human sound at all. Just the occasional rustle of branches. I remember lying in bed, feeling almost uneasy from how silent it was. I had my dog with me, a 3-year-old border collie named Max. He was always calm, but that night, even he was restless. He kept staring at the window, occasionally growling under his breath, which was odd for him. I figured it was just the smell of foxes or badgers. The next morning, I hiked around a bit. The air was cold, the kind that makes your fingers sting. I followed the creek for about a mile and noticed some strange footprints in the mud. Not boot prints, not animal tracks either. They looked like bare feet, but longer, with odd spacing between the toes. I remember crouching down, touching the edges and realizing they were deep, like whoever made them was heavy or had jumped. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I brushed it off, probably some local messing around. By the third day, things started to feel off. Max refused to go outside after dark. He'd sit by the door and stare at it, his fur slightly raised, his ears twitching like he was hearing something I couldn't. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard something moving outside. It wasn't a regular animal noise. It sounded like slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. The boards on the porch creaked under the weight. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The steps would move from one side of the cabin to the other, then stop, then start again. I didn't move, didn't turn on any lights. I just listened. Then came a sound that made my chest tighten. A faint scraping against the wall, like something was dragging a stick along the wood. Max was pressed against my leg, trembling, his eyes fixed on the window. The scraping went on for a while, then stopped. I waited for an hour before I dared to move. Eventually, I fell asleep again, but my dreams were uneasy. When I went outside in the morning, I saw marks on the side of the cabin. Long, uneven scratches along the wooden boards, about shoulder height. They didn't look like animal claw marks. They were too straight, too deliberate. There were also footprints again. Bare ones, leading from the tree-line to the cabin, and then disappearing into the grass. I stood there for a while, staring at them, my breath fogging in the cold air. I started to feel like maybe coming here alone wasn't such a great idea. That afternoon, I decided to pack my things and leave early the next morning. I had booked the cabin for a week, but I didn't care anymore. I spent the day inside, keeping the fire going, trying to distract myself by reading an old magazine I found in a drawer. The forest outside felt strange, quiet again, but not peaceful this time. Felt like something was waiting. That night was worse. The noises came back, but this time they were louder, closer. I could hear what sounded like breathing outside the wall behind my bed. Slow, steady breathing, as if someone was leaning against the cabin. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Max started growling deep in his throat. Then I heard something shuffle across the porch again, and a single heavy knock on the door. Not a bang, just one firm knock. I didn't move. I didn't even look at the door. I just sat there, frozen. The knock didn't come again. The breathing faded after a while, replaced by silence. I barely slept. When the sun came up, I packed everything in a rush. I was shaking the whole time, trying to convince myself it was some local prankster or maybe a drunk wandering through the woods. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the porch, there were muddy footprints again, bare feet same as before, but now there were handprints too. Long fingers, smeared with dirt, right on the window frame, as if someone had been peering inside. The prints were high up, higher than any normal person could easily reach without standing on something. I didn't even check the back of the cabin. I threw my stuff in the truck, called Max into the passenger seat, and started driving down the narrow dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't care about the potholes or branches hitting the sides of the truck. I just wanted to be out of those woods. About a mile down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Something was standing in the middle of the road behind me. I could only see it for a moment before a bend in the road blocked the view, but it was tall. Taller than any person I'd ever seen, and pale, like its skin didn't fit right. Its arms looked too long, hanging down past its knees. It didn't move, didn't chase, just stood there, watching. I didn't slow down once until I reached the main road and saw the first gas station. I pulled over, sat in the parking lot, and just sat there shaking for what felt like an hour. I didn't tell anyone exactly what I saw. When people asked why I came back early, I said I wasn't feeling well. A few days later, I got a call from the owner of the cabin, asking if I'd left something behind, a flashlight or something like that. He said he found the back door wide open when he went to check after I left, and muddy footprints all over the porch. He thought maybe someone had broken in after me. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. To this day, I still don't know what that thing was. Maybe it was a man, someone living wild out in those woods, someone not quite right in the head. Or maybe it was something else, something that watched people who wandered too far alone. All I know is that it was real. I can still remember the sound of those slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, the breathing outside the wall, and those long, dirty handprints on the window glass. I haven't gone camping or stayed in any isolated place since. I moved back to the city, got a small apartment where I can hear traffic and neighbors through the walls. Some nights, when it's quiet, I still wake up thinking I can hear footsteps outside the window. I tell myself it's just my imagination. But every time I close my eyes, I can still picture that figure standing in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away, its face blank and skin stretched too tight, like it wasn't meant to be human. And the worst part is, deep down, I know that whatever it was, it knew my scent, it knew my voice, and it knew exactly where I slept that night. It was the summer of 2011 when I decided to take a few weeks off work and stay at my uncle's old farm in northern Kansas. The place had been empty for years after he passed, and my mother had been asking me to check on it before the next winter. The main farmhouse was too run down for comfort, but there was a smaller cabin behind the barn, about 100 yards out, that was still in decent shape. I figured I could stay there for a while, clean up the place, and get a break from city noise. I was 29 at the time, living alone, and honestly, I just needed a change of pace. The drive there was quiet, just miles and miles of flat land and tall grass swaying in the wind. When I pulled into the dirt road leading to the farm, it felt like I'd entered a place time had forgotten. The mailbox was leaning, the barn roof sagged, and the fields were wild with weeds. The cabin sat at the back edge of the property, tucked near a line of trees that led into a shallow patch of woods. It looked small but sturdy. Gray wooden walls, a rusted tin roof, and a single porch light that probably hadn't worked in years. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and dry wood. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and spiderwebs hung in the corners. The air was still. I swept the place out, set my sleeping bag on the old cot, and opened the single window to let in some air. From there, I could see part of the field and the edge of the woods. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves, and there wasn't a single sound except for the occasional chirp of crickets. Felt peaceful, empty but peaceful. That first night passed without much happening. I cooked some canned food on the small gas stove and sat on the porch until it got dark. The night sky was deep and wide, full of stars, and the air carried that dry, earthy smell you only get in open farmland. But once the sun went down completely, the quiet became strange. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in a city. It was total. No distant cars, no people, just a vast silence that made every small noise stand out. Around midnight, I started hearing something faint, like shuffling. It sounded like dry grass moving, slow and steady. I figured it was a coyote or maybe a raccoon nosing around. The farm had been empty for years, so animals probably roamed freely now. I brushed it off and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close. The sound came and went in uneven intervals, like steps through the tall grass, stopping for a while, then starting again. By morning, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing, just the wind or my imagination. The next few days went mostly fine. I spent the mornings cleaning out the barn, throwing out old hay bales, and sorting through rusted tools. The afternoons were quiet and hot. I'd sit on the porch, drink water, and watch the fields. But every evening, once the light started fading, I'd feel that same unease creeping in. By the fifth night, I started noticing small things out of place. One morning, I found the side door of the barn slightly open, though I was sure I'd latched it. Another time, I found fresh dirt disturbed near the fence line, like something had been digging. I blamed animals again, it was a farm after all. But the pattern of the dirt looked strange, almost like footprints. Bare ones, too long, too narrow. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had died completely, and the air was thick and heavy. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. The sound of something moving outside, closer this time. Slow, careful steps through dry grass, the crunch of small twigs. I sat up on the cot and waited, my heart thudding. The sound circled around the cabin, then stopped near the porch. I could hear a faint scrape against the wood, like something brushing along the wall. I didn't move. For a long while, there was nothing, just silence so deep it almost rang in my ears. Then, a single, steady sound, breathing. I could hear it just outside the thin wooden wall, slow and heavy, as if someone was standing there, taking quiet breaths. I stayed still for what felt like an hour before it faded away. I didn't dare look out the window. In the morning, I finally stepped outside. The porch steps had faint dirt marks on them, like someone barefoot had walked there during the night. The shape was wrong, though too long, the toes uneven. I thought maybe it was a deer, but deer don't walk up steps. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks after too many nights alone. Still, that day, I packed up half my things and loaded them into the truck, just in case. But I didn't leave. I don't know why. Maybe part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared, or maybe I was just too tired to care. That evening, I went around the cabin one last time before sunset. The air felt colder, sharper than usual. I checked the barn, locked it up tight, then circled the cabin's perimeter. Near the back corner, just by the trees, I noticed something odd. Broken branches and a shallow patch of dirt, as if something had been lying there. The shape in the dirt was long, human-sized. I stared at it for a long time before walking away. That night was the worst. The noises started earlier, just after dusk. The same slow, dragging steps. This time, they came from the direction of the trees. I turned off my lantern and sat in the dark, listening. The steps came closer, moving through the grass, stopping every few seconds. Then came that same breathing again, low and strained, like someone exhausted. I sat there, gripping my flashlight, not daring to turn it on. The sound stopped right outside the cabin. For a few seconds, I thought maybe it had gone. But then I heard the faint sound of wood flexing. The porch. Then, a slow creak as if weight shifted closer to the door. The handle rattled once, softly, like someone testing it. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. I stayed frozen, waiting for it to end. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded back into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning finally came, I opened the door and saw new prints in the dirt. Clearer this time, bare feet. The prints circled the cabin and went off toward the woods again. That was it for me. I packed everything up fast and left the place before noon. As I drove down the dirt road, I looked in the mirror and saw the cabin shrinking behind me, the field swaying like nothing had happened. A few weeks later, I got a call from my cousin, who lived a few towns over. He told me someone from the county sheriff's office had contacted him. They'd been investigating reports of missing people in the area, hikers and farmhands mostly. When they searched nearby properties, they found remains buried shallow in the woods near old farms, including one that matched the property line of my uncle's land. The thought made my stomach turn. I realized that the spot I'd seen behind the cabin, the one with the flattened dirt, might not have been just some animal bed. Someone had been using that area, and maybe they'd come back to check it that night. I never went back to the farm again. It's probably still standing out there, the cabin gray and silent, hidden behind the barn and the trees. Every now and then, when I drive through open country and see fields stretching far into the distance, I get that same uneasy feeling. That sense of being watched from somewhere you can't see. I still think about those nights sometimes. The slow steps, the breathing outside the wall, the prints in the dirt. There was no mystery to it. No ghost, no legend. Just someone real, living out there in the emptiness, using the silence to move unnoticed. And I was unlucky enough to spend the night where they buried their secrets.